They said grief could hollow you out from the inside, but nobody told Zuri Langston it would make her invisible. Not invisible in the way magic makes people disappear. No, this was slower, quieter, more permanent. This was the kind of vanishing that happens in plain sight, where your body still walks through the world but your soul has packed its bags and left without forwarding address. For 8 months, Zuri had been a ghost haunting her own life on Fairmont Street, and not a single person had figured out how to bring her back. Not her mother's sweet tea and worried sighs. Not her best friend Monique's relentless phone calls that went straight to voicemail. Not even Aunt Rose's legendary Sunday dinners that used to fill Zuri's kitchen with laughter and the smell of collard greens simmered in hope. The thing about grief, real grief, the kind that rewires your nervous system and repaints your world in shades of gray you didn't know existed, is that it doesn't announce itself with drama. There's no soundtrack, no theatrical collapse in the middle of the grocery store. Zuri didn't scream or rage or throw things at walls. She just stopped. Stopped tasting her morning coffee. Stopped hearing the music from the neighbor's radio. Stopped feeling the sun on her face when she stood at her window each afternoon, watching Fairmont Street bustle with a life she could no longer remember how to join. Her apartment became a museum of before. Sweaters in the closet that still held a particular scent. A book with a ribbon marking page 147 that nobody would ever finish reading. A voicemail saved on her phone that she played sometimes at 3 in the morning when the silence got too heavy to carry alone. Every object was a landmine. Every memory was a trapdoor that opened onto nothing. The neighborhood noticed, of course. On Fairmont Street, everybody knows everybody's business. That's just how it works in tight-knit black communities where your neighbor's pain becomes your pain, where collective joy is the only kind that matters. Miss Della from 2 doors down would pause while watering her roses and call out, "You doing all right, baby?" And Zuri would nod, offer a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and keep moving like smoke. Marcus, who ran the corner store, stopped asking if she wanted her usual order because she never wanted anything anymore. Even the kids playing double dutch on the sidewalk seemed to lower their voices when she passed, as if they could sense she was made of something breakable. Aunt Rosa tried the hardest. Every Sunday she'd stand in Zuri's kitchen, stirring sweet tea with the kind of determined optimism that only black aunties can muster, waiting for Zuri to sit in that empty chair and talk until 2 in the morning the way she used to. But Zuri would hover in the doorway, present in body only, and eventually Rosa would pack up her Tupperware with a sigh that said more than words ever could. Monique, her best friend since high school, would show up unannounced with that laugh that used to lift Zuri's shoulders like wings, armed with stories and gossip and desperate energy. But grief had built walls that even 20 years of friendship couldn't scale. Still, even in her numbness, Zuri noticed things. That was the strange part, the observations that kept happening despite the emptiness. She noticed how light pooled on Miss Della's stoop at exactly 4:15 every afternoon, golden and thick as honey. She noticed the precise way Aunt Rosa folded laundry, corners meeting corners with the kind of care that suggested folding clothes was really a form of prayer. She noticed the little girl at the end of the block who would tremble before stepping into the community pool each summer, gathering courage in her tiny fists. These small noticings were threads, fine, nearly invisible threads, but they were something. And something, even the barest something, matters when you're made of nothing. Then Owen Carlyle moved in next door with a U-Haul truck, 3 boxes of books, and a crate of tomato plants that seemed absurdly optimistic for someone arriving in the city in late September. He wasn't the kind of man who demanded attention. No dramatic entrance, no loud music, no furniture that required a crew of friends and a case of beer to maneuver up narrow stairs. Owen moved in the way some people breathe, quietly, steadily, like he'd been doing it all his life and saw no reason to make a production of it. He had that look of someone who grew up in a small town where people knew each other's names and showing up mattered. Not small-town naive, but small-town rooted, the kind of man who made lists on actual paper, who said good morning to strangers, who carried the muscle memory of potlucks and porch sitting in communities that caught you when you fell. Zuri noticed him, but then again, Zuri noticed everything. She just didn't participate. He noticed her too. On his 3rd day, while unloading the last boxes, he saw her on her stoop. A corner of the world she inhabited sometimes between the house and the street, like she couldn't quite commit to either. Her face was turned toward something he couldn't see, listening to a frequency he couldn't hear. He didn't wave or call out or do any of the intrusive things people do when they're trying too hard. He just nodded, a small acknowledgement that she existed, and went back to his boxes. That evening, Zuri found a bag on her steps. Soup, the good kind, homemade, still warm in its container. A loaf of bread from the bakery on Amsterdam Avenue. A small tin of chamomile tea. No note, no expectation, just provisions. She stood there holding the bag, something flickering in her chest that might have been irritation or might have been something else entirely. Who did this? Who moved in next door and immediately started leaving food like she was some charity case, some broken thing that needed feeding? But the soup was still warm, and it had been 3 days since she'd eaten anything that wasn't crackers and obligation, so she took it inside. She heated it up. She ate it at her kitchen table while the evening light died outside her window. And for just a moment, just one small, barely noticeable moment, something in her thawed. The next day, she opened her door planning to tell him to stop, to leave her alone, to take his neighborly concern somewhere it might actually make a difference. But Owen was already there on his stoop with 2 cups of coffee and that awkward smile people wear when they're not quite sure if they're doing the right thing but they're doing it anyway. "I've lived next door for almost a week now," he said, his voice soft and undemanding. "I figured you might be running out of soup." Zuri stared at him. There was nothing theatrical about this man, nothing performative. No grand gesture promising to fix everything or save anybody. Just a bowl of soup extended between neighbors, simple as breathing. She could slam the door. She could tell him to mind his own business. She could retreat back into the safety of her carefully constructed numbness where nothing hurt because nothing touched her. Instead, she took the coffee. Her hands wrapped around the warm cup, and she felt it. Actually felt it, the heat seeping into her palms. Owen didn't say anything else. He just sat on his stoop while she stood on hers, and they existed in the same space without words, without expectations, without the weight of having to be anything other than 2 people holding coffee on a Thursday morning in September. It was the smallest thing, barely a moment. But small things, it turns out, are how you build a bridge back to the living. So here's the question that hung in the air between them that morning, the question that would determine everything that came next. When you've been a ghost for so long, when you've forgotten what it feels like to be real, what does it take for one human being to reach through the veil and remind another that they're still here? That they still matter? That the world hasn't finished with them yet? Because Zuri Langston was about to find out. Owen Carlyle made a decision that morning that would change everything. He decided to be relentlessly, quietly, impossibly present. Not in the aggressive way some people force themselves into your life, showing up uninvited with solutions and pity and the kind of help that feels more like suffocation. No, Owen's presence was different. It was the kind that existed in the margins, in the spaces between need and offer, in the patient distance that says, "I'm here when you're ready," without ever actually saying the words. And for Zuri Langston, who had spent 8 months building walls so high even she couldn't see over them anymore, this particular kind of patience was either going to save her or destroy her. She just didn't know which yet. The pattern started small. Every morning at 7:15, Owen would sit on his stoop with 2 cups of coffee. He'd drink one. The other would sit there, steam rising into the autumn air, an invitation without words. Sometimes Zuri would ignore it completely, watching from behind her curtains as the coffee grew cold and Owen eventually took both cups inside. Sometimes she'd wait until he went back in, then slip out and take the cup, drinking it alone on her steps like a feral cat accepting food but refusing touch. And sometimes, just sometimes, she'd open her door while he was still there, and they'd sit in silence, 2 people drinking coffee in proximity but not quite together. Owen never pushed, never asked, "How are you feeling?" Or, "Do you want to talk about it?" None of those invasive questions that grief tourists ask when they're more interested in the spectacle of your pain than the reality of your healing. He'd just sit there, sometimes commenting on the weather, sometimes mentioning that his tomato plants were struggling with the temperature drop, sometimes saying nothing at all. And in that nothing, Zuri found something she didn't know she'd been missing: the permission to exist without performing recovery. But here's what nobody tells you about healing. It doesn't happen in a straight line. It happens in spirals and circles, in steps forward and stumbles back, in moments of progress followed immediately by regression so complete you forget you ever moved at all. And Zuri was about to learn this lesson the hard way. 3 weeks into Owen's quiet campaign of neighboring, Zuri made her first mistake. She laughed. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Owen was attempting to install a shelf on his front wall and he'd measured wrong. Anyone could see it was crooked, leaning at an angle that defied both physics and common sense. He stepped back, tilted his head and said, "I'm calling it art." Intentional postmodern commentary on the rigid expectations of horizontal surfaces. And Zuri, standing on her stoop with a bag of groceries she'd actually shopped for instead of having delivered, she laughed. Not a polite chuckle or a forced exhale, but a real laugh, the kind that comes from your belly and surprises you with its own existence. The sound hung in the air between them for exactly 3 seconds. Then Zuri's face changed. The laughter died like a candle in a sudden wind, and something that looked like panic, no, worse than panic, guilt, flooded her features. She dropped her groceries, onions rolling across the pavement, bread falling in the dirt, and she ran inside. The door slammed with a finality that echoed down the entire block. Owen stood there with his crooked shelf, tomato plants wilting in their pots, watching the space where Zuri had been. He knew what had just happened because he'd seen it before, in his own life, in other people's losses. That moment when you forget to grieve, when joy sneaks up and reminds you that you're still alive, and then the crushing wave of guilt that follows because how dare you laugh when someone you loved is gone forever? How dare you feel anything except the weight of their absence? He gave her space. For days of space. For days where the second coffee cup sat on his stoop, untouched, growing cold in the October air. For days where Zuri's curtains stayed drawn and her door stayed shut and the whole block seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if she'd slip back completely into that ghost existence or if something had shifted, something irreversible. On the 5th day, Aunt Rosa showed up. Now, Aunt Rosa was not a woman who believed in subtle interventions. She arrived at Zuri's door at 9 in the morning with 3 Tupperware containers of food, a determination that could move mountains, and 0 patience for self-imposed isolation. She knocked once, twice, 3 times, each knock increasing in volume and authority. When Zuri didn't answer, Rosa did what any self-respecting black auntie would do. She used the spare key she'd kept since Zuri first moved to Fairmont Street and let herself in. "Baby?" Rosa called into the darkened apartment. "I know you're in here, and I know you're hurting, but we're going to sit down and have a conversation about this." She found Zuri curled on the couch, still in yesterday's clothes, eyes red from crying or not sleeping or both. Rosa set down the Tupperware, sat on the coffee table directly in front of her niece, and waited. Not with judgment, but with the kind of patient love that runs deeper than blood. The kind that says, "I will sit here until the end of time if that's what it takes." "I laughed," Zuri whispered finally, her voice raw. "I laughed, Aunt Rosa. What kind of person laughs when—" She couldn't finish, couldn't say the name, couldn't complete the thought that had been eating her alive for 4 days. Rosa reached out and took Zuri's hands, holding them firm. The kind of person who's still living, that's who. The kind of person who's allowed to exist in more than one emotion at the same time. You think love means never feeling anything else? You think the people we lose want us to die alongside them. But it feels like betrayal, Zuri said. And there it was. The core wound. The belief that had been keeping her frozen for 8 months. That moving forward meant leaving behind. That healing meant forgetting. That joy was a betrayal of grief. Rosa squeezed her hands tighter. "Listen to me. Grief doesn't leave, baby. It doesn't pack up and go home. You carry it forever. But you know what else you carry? Everything else. The laughter and the sunshine and the taste of good food and the kindness of neighbors who sit on their stoops with coffee they know might go cold. You carry it all, Zuri. That's what being human means. That's what love means. Carrying everything at once." The words hung in the air like a spell, like an invitation, like a challenge. Could Zuri carry both? Could she hold grief in one hand and life in the other? Could she be both broken and healing, both mourning and moving, both remembering and returning? She didn't know. But for the first time in 8 months, she wanted to try. Owen saw Zuri emerge 2 days later. Not fully, not completely, but emerging nonetheless. Like a plant pushing through concrete, determined and fragile and impossibly brave. She came to her stoop in the morning, and when he offered the coffee, she took it while he was still there. They sat in silence, but this time the silence felt different. Less like absence, more like waiting. Less like ending, more like beginning. "I'm sorry," Zuri said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "About the other day. You don't owe me an apology," Owen interrupted gently. "You don't owe me anything, Zuri. Not explanations, not recovery, not a timeline for healing. You owe yourself permission to feel whatever you feel when you feel it. That's all." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and something in her chest, that frozen thing that had been locked up tight for so long, it cracked. Just a hairline fracture, barely noticeable, but it was something. And something, as Zuri was learning, was how you started. But here's where the story gets complicated. Because healing is never as simple as one conversation, one realization, one moment of clarity. Healing is messy and nonlinear and full of setbacks that feel like failures but are really just part of the process. And Zuri was about to face her biggest setback yet. The block party was Fairmont Street's annual tradition. Every first Saturday in November, the whole community came together to celebrate before winter locked everyone inside. There were grills smoking with ribs and chicken, tables covered in potato salad and cornbread and sweet potato pie, kids running through sprinklers one last time before the cold set in, old folks sitting in lawn chairs telling stories that got bigger and better with each retelling. It was the kind of event that made Fairmont Street feel less like a neighborhood and more like a family. Zuri hadn't gone in 2 years. The first year, she'd still been present enough to attend, to smile and eat and pretend. The second year, last year, 8 months into her grief, she'd stayed inside with the curtains drawn, listening to the music and laughter filter through her walls like sounds from another universe. This year, Aunt Rosa had made it clear, Zuri was going. Not as punishment, not as forced participation, but as an act of faith. Faith that Zuri was strong enough. Faith that the community would catch her if she stumbled. Faith that healing sometimes requires showing up even when every part of you wants to hide. Owen was already there when Zuri arrived, standing near the grill talking to Marcus from the corner store. He looked different outside his usual context. Relaxed, smiling, integrated into the fabric of Fairmont Street in a way that suggested he'd always belonged. When he saw Zuri, he didn't make a big deal of it, didn't rush over or draw attention. He just nodded, that same small acknowledgement from his first day, and went back to his conversation, giving her space to exist on her own terms. Miss Della was the first to approach, wrapping Zuri in a hug that smelled like rose water and unconditional acceptance. "Look at you, baby," she said, holding Zuri at arm's length. "Look at you coming back to us." There were tears in the old woman's eyes, and Zuri realized with a start that her grief hadn't just affected her. It had rippled out, touching everyone who loved her, creating a collective ache that the whole block had been carrying. Monique arrived like a hurricane, all energy and noise and fierce joy. "Girl, if you make me cry at this block party, I will never forgive you," she said. But she was already crying, pulling Zuri into a hug that lasted so long people started to stare. "I missed you," Monique whispered. "I missed you so much." "I'm sorry," Zuri said, and she meant it. Sorry for disappearing. Sorry for the unanswered calls. Sorry for becoming a ghost when Monique needed her friend. "Stop apologizing and come eat this potato salad with me so we can judge which auntie made it, because there's a competition happening and neither of them will admit it," Monique said, and just like that, they were walking toward the food tables, arms linked, and Zuri was participating in life again. The afternoon unfolded in moments that felt both ordinary and miraculous. Zuri ate 3 pieces of sweet potato pie because Aunt Rosa kept putting them on her plate, and Zuri didn't have the heart to refuse. She watched the kids play and felt something that might have been joy, or might have been the memory of joy, or might have been the promise of joy returning. She sat with the old folks and listened to their stories, laughing in the right places, present in a way she hadn't been in months. And Owen stayed at the edges of her awareness, always visible but never intrusive, always there but never demanding. She watched him help Miss Della carry chairs, watched him play catch with the neighborhood kids, watched him exist in this community with the same quiet ease he brought to everything else. And she wondered, for the first time, who Owen Carlyle really was beneath the patient neighbor routine. What losses had taught him to be so gentle. What grief had shown him how to hold space for someone else's pain. But good moments, especially fragile new good moments, have a way of attracting complications. And Zuri's complication arrived at 4:30 in the form of a familiar car pulling up to the block party. A face she hadn't seen in 8 months stepping out onto the pavement. His name was James, and he had been her person's best friend. The one who'd called her every week after the funeral, who'd offered to help sort through belongings, who'd wanted to grieve alongside her. But Zuri had shut him out along with everyone else, unable to bear the reflection of her loss in someone else's eyes. And now here he was, standing at the edge of the block party with grief and hope and question marks written across his face. Zuri felt the air leave her lungs, felt the carefully constructed stability of the afternoon crack like ice under sudden weight. James was walking toward her, and she couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything except stand there while the past 8 months rushed back with devastating clarity. "Zuri," James said, and his voice carried everything they'd both lost. "I've been trying to reach you." She wanted to run, wanted to disappear back into her apartment and lock the door and pretend she'd never come outside, never tried to heal, never let herself believe that moving forward was possible. But before she could move, she felt a presence beside her. Owen, standing close enough that his shoulder brushed hers, not touching but there, solid and steady and real. "I'm sorry," Zuri managed to say to James. "I couldn't. I didn't know how to." "I know," James said, and his eyes were wet. "I know, but I need to talk to you. About the foundation. About the memorial fund. About finishing what was started before." He couldn't say it either. Couldn't complete the sentence that ended with absence. The foundation. God, Zuri had forgotten. Before everything, before the loss, there had been plans. A community foundation to help kids on blocks like Fairmont Street get access to arts programs. It had been a dream, a project, a legacy in the making. And when the loss happened, Zuri had abandoned it along with everything else. "I can't," Zuri said, panic rising in her throat. "James, I can't do this. I'm not ready, I can't." "You don't have to decide anything right now," Owen said quietly, and it was the first time he'd inserted himself directly into Zuri's life like this. The first time he'd acted as more than a quiet neighbor. "James, is it? Why don't you give Zuri some time to process this? And maybe you two can meet up later this week to talk." James looked at Owen, then back at Zuri, and something like understanding crossed his face. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, okay. Zuri, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to ambush you. I thought you'd want to know. I thought you'd want to be part of finishing what was started. But take your time. Here's my number if it's changed." He handed her a card, nodded to both of them, and walked back toward his car. Zuri stood there trembling, the card in her hand feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The foundation, the unfinished dream, the project that had mattered so much to the person she'd lost. How could she possibly face that? How could she step back into that world of plans and purpose when she could barely manage to show up to a block party without falling apart? "You're okay?" Owen said softly, and somehow his voice cut through the panic. "You're okay, Zuri. Breathe." She breathed. In and out. In and out. Slowly, the world stopped spinning quite so fast. "I need to go home," she said. "Okay," Owen said. "I'll walk with you." They left the block party together, Zuri's exit drawing concerned looks from Aunt Rosa and Monique, but Owen subtly shook his head at them. "Not now, let her go, she's okay." They walked the half-block to their buildings in silence, and when they reached Zuri's stoop, she finally spoke. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, and it came out more accusatory than she intended. "Why do you care? You don't even know me, Owen. You moved in 2 months ago and you've been, what, fixing me? Saving the broken neighbor? Is this some kind of project for you?" Owen took the accusation without flinching. "Do you really think that's what this is?" he asked. "I don't know what this is." Zuri's voice rose, 8 months of frozen emotion finally thawing into anger. "I don't know why you're here, Why you keep showing up? Why you won't just let me be broken in peace? Because you're not broken, Owen said, and his voice was still calm, still steady. You're grieving. There's a difference. And I'm not trying to fix you, Zuri. I'm just trying to be a decent human being to my neighbor. But why? She pressed. Why do you know how to do this? How to be patient and present and not push? Who taught you to sit with someone else's grief like it doesn't scare you? Owen was quiet for a long moment. Then he sat down on her stoop, uninvited, and looked up at her. My sister, he said finally. Her name was Claire. She died 6 years ago. Car accident. And after, I became the person you are right now. The ghost. The one who couldn't figure out how to exist in a world that kept spinning when my world had stopped. And there was this neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, old woman who'd lived in my building for 40 years, and she just kept showing up, kept leaving soup, kept sitting with me, never asked me to be anything other than what I was. And eventually, slowly, I came back. Not all the way, not the same, but back. Back enough to live again. Back enough to taste my coffee and hear music and remember that existing in the world wasn't a betrayal of Claire's memory. He paused. So when I moved here and I saw you, I recognized you, Zuri. I saw myself. And I thought maybe I could be for you what Mrs. Patterson was for me. Not a savior. Just a witness. Just someone who's willing to sit in the uncomfortable truth that grief is real and terrible, and also not the end of everything. Zuri felt tears streaming down her face. But for once, she didn't try to stop them. I laughed the other day, she said through the tears, and it felt like I was betraying them, like I was choosing life over memory. And I ran inside and I hated myself for 4 days straight because how dare I feel anything except grief? How dare I forget even for a second? You didn't forget, Owen said. You'll never forget. But you remembered something else too. That you're still here. That you're still alive. And that's not betrayal, Zuri. That's not moving on or leaving behind or any of those things we tell ourselves. That's just being human. That's carrying love forward instead of staying buried with it. The words hit something deep inside her. Something that had been locked away and sealed and declared off limits. Could it really be that simple? Could she really carry both, the grief and the joy, the loss and the life, the memory and the movement forward? I don't know how, she whispered. Nobody does, Owen said. You just do it one day at a time. One cup of coffee. One laugh. One block party where you stay for 3 hours instead of hiding inside. One conversation with someone who wants to finish a dream you thought died. You just keep showing up, and eventually showing up becomes living again. Zuri sat down beside him on the stoop. They sat there as evening fell over Fairmont Street, as the block party noise slowly died down, as the October air grew cold enough to make them shiver. And somewhere in that sitting, in that silence, in that shared space between grief and grace, something in Zuri shifted. Not healed, healing would take years, maybe forever, but shifted, opened, allowed the possibility that maybe, just maybe, she could be both grieving and alive, both broken and whole, both remembering and returning. The foundation, she said quietly. I don't know if I can face it. You don't have to decide tonight, Owen said, or this week, or even this month. You just have to decide if you want to find out if you can. The rest comes later. She nodded, not in agreement but in acknowledgement. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication, loaded with possibility. Could she really step back into that dream? Could she honor the person she'd lost by finishing what they'd started together? Or would it destroy her to try? But before she could spiral too deep into that question, Owen stood up and offered his hand. Come on, he said. I make terrible pasta, but I make it consistently. You should come eat some terrible pasta and tell me about this foundation. Not to make decisions, just to talk. Just to practice being alive for one more evening. Zuri looked at his hand. At the invitation it represented. At the tiny step forward it required. Every instinct she had told her to decline, to go inside, to lock the door and retreat back into safety. But there was another voice now, quieter but growing stronger. The voice that sounded like Aunt Rosa and Owen and maybe even her own forgotten self, saying that being alive meant accepting invitations, meant sitting with people even when it was uncomfortable, meant practicing the small acts of living until they became natural again. She took his hand, let him pull her to her feet, and together, they walked the 5 steps to his door, and she stepped inside a neighbor's home for the first time in 8 months. And she sat at his small kitchen table while he boiled water and burned garlic and told her stories about his sister Claire that made her laugh and cry simultaneously. And she told him about the foundation, about the dreams that had died, about the person whose absence still took her breath away. And in the telling, in the sharing, in the sacred act of being witnessed in her grief, something remarkable happened. Zuri didn't heal. Not completely, not magically, not in the way stories usually suggest healing happens. But she remembered how to be a person who could sit at a table and eat terrible pasta and talk about both loss and dreams in the same conversation. She remembered that she could hold multiple truths at once, that she was devastated and that she was alive, that she was broken and that she was mending, that she could grieve forever and still learn to laugh again. And when she finally went home that night, when she finally closed her door and stood in her apartment that had been a tomb for so long, she did something she hadn't done in 8 months. She opened the windows, let the night air in, let Fairmont Street's sounds filter through, car horns and distant music and the voices of neighbors saying goodnight. She didn't close the curtains. She let the streetlight illuminate her living room, let the world back in, let herself be part of something larger than her own grief. It was the smallest act. But small acts, Zuri was learning, were how you rebuilt a life. But here's the question that kept her awake that night, the question that would haunt the days to come. If she really stepped back into that foundation, if she really tried to finish what had been started, would it honor the memory of what she'd lost, or would it destroy the fragile healing she'd only just begun? And was Owen's gentle presence enough to catch her if trying meant falling apart all over again? The question that haunted Zuri for the next 3 days was simple but terrifying. What if she tried and failed? What if she opened herself to the possibility of finishing the foundation, of stepping back into that dream that had died alongside someone she loved, and she couldn't do it? What if the grief swallowed her whole again? What if this fragile, tentative healing she'd built, coffee on stoops, terrible pasta dinners, laughs that didn't immediately trigger guilt, what if all of it shattered the moment she tried to reach for something bigger than survival? But here's what Zuri was beginning to understand. Slowly, painfully, one small revelation at a time. The question wasn't really, what if I fail? The question was, what if I never try? Because staying frozen was its own kind of failure. Staying a ghost was its own kind of death. And somewhere between Owen's patient presence and Aunt Rose's fierce love, and her own desperate need to remember what living felt like, Zuri had started to believe that trying, even if it meant falling, was better than never moving at all. She called James on a Tuesday morning. Her hands shook while dialing, and she almost hung up twice before he answered. But she made the call. They met at the coffee shop on Amsterdam Avenue, the one with the mismatched chairs and the barista who knew everyone's order. James looked older than she remembered, grief having carved lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 8 months ago. They'd both been changed by the same loss, both been marked by the same absence, but they'd grieved in isolation, each one drowning alone when they could have helped each other float. "I'm sorry," Zuri said before James could even sit down. "I'm sorry I disappeared. I'm sorry I didn't return your calls. I'm sorry I left you to carry this alone." James shook his head, and his smile was sad but genuine. "Zuri, you don't have to apologize for surviving the only way you knew how. I get it. I really do. I need you to know that the foundation doesn't have to die just because—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "Just because the person who dreamed it up isn't here to see it through. We can finish this, together, if you're ready." Ready. What a strange word. Was anyone ever ready to step back into a dream that had been interrupted by death? Was anyone ever prepared to build something beautiful on top of something broken? Zuri didn't feel ready. She felt terrified and uncertain and like she might shatter at any moment. But she also felt something else. A tiny flicker of purpose. A small flame of meaning that had been extinguished for so long she'd forgotten it could exist. "Tell me where we are," Zuri said. "Tell me what's left to do." And James told her. The paperwork was filed, the nonprofit status approved, the initial donors secured. What they needed now was the actual programming, the curriculum for the arts workshops, the partnerships with local schools, the logistics of making this dream operational. It was work, real work, the kind that required showing up day after day, making decisions, carrying forward a vision that belonged to someone who couldn't carry it anymore. "I can't promise I won't fall apart," Zuri said honestly. "I can't promise I'll be consistent or reliable or—" "I'm not asking for promises," James interrupted. "I'm asking if you want to try. That's all. Just try. We figure out the rest as we go." Zuri thought about Owen's words from that night on the stoop. "You just have to decide if you want to find out if you can. The rest comes later." She thought about Aunt Rose's insistence that you could carry both grief and everything else, that being human meant holding multiple truths at once. She thought about that laugh that had escaped her weeks ago, the one that had sent her spiraling into guilt but had also proved that she was still capable of joy, still capable of feeling something other than emptiness. "Okay," she said. "Okay, let's try." The word felt massive leaving her mouth. Okay. Such a small word for such an enormous commitment. But that was the thing about healing. It happened in small words, in tiny steps, in ordinary moments that accumulated into something extraordinary. James's face broke into the first genuine smile she'd seen from him in 8 months. "Really? Really?" Zuri confirmed. "But I'm going to need help. I'm going to need people to catch me when I stumble. Because I will stumble, James. I'm still barely holding it together most days." "Then we'll build a team that holds it together with you," James said. "You're not alone in this, Zuri. You never were. We just lost each other for a while." They spent the next 2 hours mapping out a plan. Small steps, manageable pieces, nothing too overwhelming. Zuri would start by reviewing the curriculum proposals. Just reading, just offering feedback, nothing that required her to lead or decide or carry the full weight. Baby steps, training wheels, practice at being purposeful again. When Zuri left the coffee shop, something had shifted in her chest. Not healed. She was beginning to understand that healing wasn't a destination but a direction. But lighter, more open, like she'd been holding her breath for 8 months and had finally remembered how to exhale. Owen was on his stoop when she got home, and somehow this no longer surprised her. His presence had become woven into the fabric of her days, as natural as the sunrise, as consistent as the seasons. She sat down beside him without being invited, and he handed her a cup of coffee that was still warm, like he'd been waiting. "I called James," she said. "Yeah." Owen's voice was careful, not pushing. "Yeah, we're going to try to finish the foundation. I'm terrified, but we're going to try." Owen didn't say, "I'm proud of you," or "That's great," or any of the automatic responses people give when you tell them something significant. He just nodded, a slow acknowledgement that held more meaning than words. "That's brave," he said finally. "Or stupid," Zuri countered. "Brave and stupid aren't mutually exclusive," Owen said, and there was humor in his voice now. "Some of the bravest things we do are also the stupidest. Doesn't make them less brave." They sat in silence for a while, drinking coffee, watching Fairmont Street wake up fully. Miss Della watering her roses, kids waiting for the school bus, Marcus opening the corner store. All the ordinary rituals of community life that Zuri had watched from behind glass for so long. "Can I ask you something?" Zuri said. "Always. That night you told me about your sister, about Claire. Do you still have hard days? Days where the grief comes back so strong it feels like it just happened?" Owen was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I do. Not as often as I used to, but they still come. Anniversaries, songs, random Tuesday afternoons when something reminds me and it hits like a freight train. The grief doesn't go away, Zuri. It learns to coexist with everything else. It becomes part of your landscape instead of the whole terrain." "How do you handle those days?" "I let myself feel them," Owen said. "I don't fight them anymore. I just acknowledge that today is a hard day, and I'm gentle with myself, and I reach out if I need to. I call my mom. I visit Claire's favorite spot. I sit with it instead of running from it. And eventually, not quickly, but eventually, the wave passes. And I'm still here. Still standing. Zuri absorbed this, turning it over in her mind. The permission to have hard days. The understanding that healing wasn't linear, wasn't permanent, wasn't a state you achieved and then maintained forever. It was more like breathing. Something you had to keep doing, consciously, intentionally, day after day. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for being patient with me, for not giving up when I pushed you away, for seeing me when I couldn't see myself." Owen turned to look at her, and his eyes held something warm and complicated. "Zuri, you don't have to thank me for basic human decency. I didn't do anything extraordinary. I just showed up. Anyone could have done it." "But you did do it," Zuri insisted. "When everyone else had given up or didn't know how to reach me anymore, you kept showing up. That matters. It mattered then, and it matters now." They looked at each other for a long moment, and something passed between them that was too complicated to name. Not quite romance, not quite friendship, but something that contained elements of both and also something entirely its own. A connection forged in grief and patience and coffee cups on stoops. A recognition of shared humanity, shared struggle, shared survival. "Come on," Owen said, standing up. "I need to run to the hardware store. Come with me. Let's practice being alive on a Wednesday morning." And Zuri went. Not because she had to, not out of obligation or politeness, but because she wanted to. Because being alive meant saying yes to small invitations, meant participating in ordinary moments, meant choosing connection over isolation even when isolation felt safer. The weeks that followed were a mosaic of small victories and occasional setbacks. Zuri attended the first foundation meeting with James and 2 other team members, and she made it through 90 minutes before having to excuse herself to cry in the bathroom. But she came back. She finished the meeting. She didn't let the crying mean she was broken beyond repair. It just meant she was feeling, and feeling was part of healing. She had dinner with Aunt Rosa and actually talked instead of just nodding and pushing food around her plate. She told Rosa about the foundation, about Owen, about the terrifying hopeful possibility that maybe she could build a life that honored her loss without being consumed by it. Rosa cried and hugged her and said, "Baby, I've been waiting for you to come back to us. Not because we needed you, but because you needed you." Monique started coming over regularly again, and they fell back into their old rhythm of talking until late at night about everything and nothing. Zuri still had moments where she'd drift away, where Monique would have to gently call her back to the present. But those moments were getting shorter, less frequent, less all-consuming. The foundation work became real. They secured a location for the first workshop series. They hired an arts instructor. They reached out to the local middle school about partnerships. And with each small step, each tiny victory, Zuri felt less like a ghost and more like a person. Not the person she'd been before. That person was gone, changed irrevocably by loss, but a new person. Someone who carried grief but wasn't defined by it. Someone who could honor memory while also choosing life. Owen remained a steady presence throughout, but something between them was shifting. The patient-neighbor routine had evolved into genuine friendship, and friendship was blurring into something deeper, something neither of them was quite ready to name. They spent evenings on each other's stoops, cooked meals together, talked about everything from the mundane to the meaningful. Owen told Zuri stories about Claire. Not just the sad parts, but the funny parts, the infuriating parts, the fully human parts that made her more than just a tragedy. And Zuri, slowly, began to share her own stories. The good memories, the complicated ones, the ones that made her laugh and cry simultaneously. One night in late November, as they sat in Owen's living room eating pizza and arguing about whether pineapple belonged on pizza, a debate that had become their running joke, Owen said something that changed everything. "I need to tell you something," he said, and his voice was serious enough that Zuri put down her pizza and gave him full attention. "My company offered me a promotion. It's a good opportunity, really good, but it would mean relocating to Boston, and I need to give them an answer by the end of the month." The words hit Zuri like cold water. Owen leaving, Owen moving away, the steady presence that had become so integral to her healing, the patient friend who'd taught her how to be alive again, the person who'd seen her at her worst and hadn't flinched. He might leave. Oh, Zuri said, and the word came out smaller than she intended. I haven't decided yet, Owen said quickly. I'm not. This isn't me saying goodbye. I just wanted you to know. Wanted to be honest with you about what I'm considering. Zuri felt panic rising in her chest. That old familiar fear of loss, of abandonment, of people leaving and never coming back. But underneath the panic was something else. A realization that was uncomfortable but necessary. She had built her healing on Owen's presence. She had used his steadiness as scaffolding for her recovery. And now she needed to figure out if she could stand without that scaffolding. If the healing was real or if it was just dependency wearing a prettier name. You should take it, Zuri said, and she meant it even though it hurt to say. If it's what you want, if it's good for you, you should take it. You can't stay here just because I need you to. That's not fair to either of us. Owen looked at her with something like surprise. I'm not making this decision based on what you need, Zuri. I'm making it based on what I want. And that's the complicated part. I don't know what I want anymore. I moved here to start over, to build community, to plant roots. And I've done that. I've built something here. With you, with this block, with this neighborhood. The promotion is good, but it's also just a job. And jobs come and go. But communities, real communities, those are harder to find. But you can build community in Boston too, Zuri said. You're good at that, Owen. You're good at seeing people, at showing up, at being present. You'll build something beautiful wherever you go. Maybe, Owen said. But I don't want to leave what I've already built here. I don't want to leave. He stopped, not quite saying the thing that hung in the air between them. You, Zuri thought. He doesn't want to leave me, and I don't want him to leave. But I can't ask him to stay. Because asking him to stay means admitting how much I've come to depend on him, how much his presence has meant, how much I care about him in ways that have nothing to do with grief and everything to do with who he is as a person. What do you want me to say? Zuri asked softly. I want you to tell me the truth, Owen said. I want you to tell me if this, he gestured between them, means something to you beyond me being the neighbor who helped you heal. Because if it's just that, if I'm just a part of your recovery process, then I should probably take the job. But if it's something more, Zuri felt her heart hammering. This was it. The moment where she had to be honest, had to be vulnerable in a completely new way. Not vulnerable in her grief, but vulnerable in her hope. Not admitting her brokenness, but admitting her capacity to feel something new. It's more, she said. And the words felt like jumping off a cliff. Owen, it's more. You're not just the person who helped me heal. You're the person I want to have coffee with every morning. The person whose terrible pasta I actually enjoy. The person who makes me laugh and makes me think and makes me want to keep showing up for life even on the hard days. And that terrifies me because I didn't think I could feel this way again. I didn't think I had space for new feelings when I was still carrying so much grief. But somehow you've made room. You've shown me that my heart is bigger than I thought. That I can grieve and love simultaneously. And I don't want you to leave, Owen. But I also can't be the reason you stay. You have to make this decision for yourself. Owen was quiet for a long moment, and Zuri felt her vulnerability hanging in the air like something fragile and precious and terrifying. Then he smiled, that same awkward, genuine smile from the first day with the soup, and said, I'm not taking the job. Owen, I'm not taking it, he repeated. Not because you need me to stay, but because I want to stay. Because I've built something here that matters to me. Because I've found community and purpose and yeah, because I found you. And I'm not ready to walk away from that. Not for a promotion. Not for anything. Zuri felt tears streaming down her face. But they weren't sad tears. They were the complicated, messy, beautiful tears that come when something painful starts to transform into something hopeful. She was crying because Owen was staying. She was crying because she'd admitted she wanted him to stay. She was crying because for the first time in 8 months, she was allowing herself to feel something that wasn't grief. She was feeling joy. She was feeling hope. She was feeling the tentative, terrifying possibility of new love. Owen reached over and took her hand, and Zuri let him. Let herself be held. Let herself be seen. Let herself be present in this moment without guilt or fear or the crushing weight of betrayal. Because this wasn't betrayal. This was life. This was what it meant to carry loss forward instead of staying buried with it. This was choosing to be alive. The Foundation's first workshop launched the week before Christmas. 15 middle school kids from the neighborhood, eager and nervous and creative, filed into the community center for the inaugural session. Zuri stood at the back of the room watching the arts instructor lead them through introductions, and she felt something she hadn't felt in so long she'd almost forgotten what it was called. Pride. Not pride in herself, but pride in this dream that had survived death. This legacy that honored memory by creating something new. This proof that loss didn't have to mean ending. James stood beside her, and he must have felt it too because he said quietly, "They would have loved this." "Yeah," Zuri said. "Yeah, they would have." The grief was still there. It would always be there. But it had become part of the landscape instead of the whole terrain, just like Owen had said. She could stand in a room watching kids laugh and create and discover themselves, and she could feel grief and joy simultaneously. She could honor what she'd lost while also celebrating what she'd built. She could be both remembering and present, both mourning and moving forward. After the workshop, Zuri walked home through Fairmont Street in the December cold, and everything looked different than it had 8 months ago. The same buildings, the same stoops, the same neighbors, but different. Alive, vibrant, full of possibility, because she was different. She was no longer the ghost walking through her own life. She was present. She was participating. She was choosing to be here in this body, in this neighborhood, in this moment. Owen was on his stoop waiting with 2 cups of hot chocolate because of course he was. Some rhythms, some patterns, some small consistencies were worth keeping. Zuri sat beside him, accepted the cup, and they sat in comfortable silence watching Miss Della's Christmas lights twinkle in the early evening. "You did good today," Owen said. "We did good today," Zuri corrected. "All of us, the team, the community, everyone who showed up. Fair enough." They sat quietly for a while longer, and then Zuri said something she'd been thinking about for weeks. "I want to tell you about them, about the person I lost. Not just the sad parts or the grief parts, the real parts, the whole story. Would you want to hear that?" Owen turned to her, and his eyes held understanding and patience and something that might have been love. "I would be honored to hear that." And so Zuri told him. Right there on the stoop in the December cold, she told Owen the full story. The laughter and the dreams and the arguments and the love, and the plans that would never be realized and the memories that she would carry forever. She told him everything, and Owen listened without trying to fix or solve or minimize. He just listened, bearing witness to her loss and her love and her healing all at once. When she finished, when the story had been told and the tears had been cried and the silence had settled between them, Owen said, "Thank you for trusting me with that, for trusting me with them." Zuri leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat like that as Fairmont Street settled into evening, as neighbors called good night to each other, as Christmas lights turned the block into something magical. And Zuri realized something profound. She was home. Not home in the sense of a place, but home in the sense of being present in her own life again. Home in her body, home in her community, home in the terrifying, beautiful, messy reality of being alive. The grief hadn't left. It would never leave. But it had taught her something essential. That love doesn't die when people do. Transforms. It moves forward. It creates legacies and foundations and new connections. It reminds you that you're still here, still capable, still worthy of joy and purpose and gentle, patient love from people who choose to see you even when you can't see yourself. Grief had made Zuri a ghost, but people, Owen and Aunt Rosa and Monique and James and the entire Fairmont Street community, they had brought her back to life. Not by fixing her or saving her, but by showing up, by being patient, by reminding her, day after day, cup of coffee after cup of coffee, that she still mattered, that she was still here, that the world hadn't finished with her yet. And now, sitting on her stoop with Owen beside her and the foundation launched and her heart learning to hold multiple truths at once, Zuri finally understood what it meant to be alive after loss. It meant carrying everything, the grief and the joy, the memory and the present, the past and the future, all at the same time. It meant being human in the fullest, most complicated, most beautiful sense of the word. She was no longer a ghost. She was Zuri Langston, resident of Fairmont Street, founder of a community arts program, friend and daughter and niece, and maybe something more to the patient man beside her. She was grieving and healing and living and hoping all at once. And that, she realized, was exactly where she was supposed to be. So here's what I want to know from you. Who in your life needs someone to show up for them the way Owen showed up for Zuri? Who needs patient presence? Who needs consistent small gestures? Who needs someone to sit with them in their grief without trying to fix it? And maybe more importantly, who has shown up for you when you needed it most? Drop a comment below and tell me about the people who've helped you come back to life when loss tried to make you a ghost. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that healing is possible, that community matters, that small acts of kindness can rebuild entire lives. And if this story moved you, hit that subscribe button because we're going to keep telling stories about real people, real struggle, and the messy, beautiful process of finding your way back to yourself. Your story matters. Your healing matters. And you're not alone in this. Let's keep showing up for each other, one cup of coffee, one conversation, one act of witness at a time.